One of the big emphases of Holiday Bible Club was the fact that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. It was emphasized in the teaching. It was emphasized during the drama. It was emphasized in every facet during the time that the kids broke away to sit with one another in groups and be taught by their leaders. It was emphasized during that time. It was emphasized in the memory of the Bible verses that Jesus Christ is God. And so if we had to take those kids and put them where you are sitting this morning and ask them the question that you see up on the screen, who is Jesus Christ? Despite the attempts of the evil guy in the play, Screwtape, and his sidekick Mimi, to convince people that Jesus Christ is in fact not God, that the prophecies that were made about him didn't come true, and so therefore they have no reason to believe who he is, those children would say to you, no, he is. He is the Son of God. He is God in human flesh. Well, in 2011, I had the privilege of going to New York City with a friend of mine. He said, I'd love for you to go and listen to Arnold Fruchtenbaum up in the north of New York State, but we're going to go to New York City, and what do you want to do? And of course, the first thing that came to mind is I want to go and see the Yankees playing baseball. But what I also got to do during that time was to go to a trendy New York restaurant in an area called Tribeca, which is apparently quite a trendy area of New York City. I didn't really know at the time. But when we went to this restaurant, we ended up going there with Michael's Jewish cousin and her atheist fiance. And during the course of the dinner, Michael is a Jewish believer in Jesus. During the course of the dinner, evidently because I was a pastor and he was a believer in this individual called Jesus Christ, she felt the need, the compulsion to look at us and to say, by the way, I don't think Jesus is a bad man, I think he's a good man. And she was visibly taken aback when I said to her, that's not one of the options. And she was even more shaken when I said, he is either the Lord of all creation, or he is a liar, a lunatic, or mere legend. Friends, those are the only options that we have at our disposal. And maybe you're sitting here this morning and you haven't made up your mind about Jesus Christ, who he is and what he's done for you. I want to tell you, those are the only options that you have available to you. You cannot walk away from here concluding that he is merely a good man, because that is something he simply cannot be. Over the years, many Christians have used that argument. They've had discussions with their unsaved friends about Jesus, and they've pulled out the Lord, liar, lunatic, legend discussion for them to have. But I think the guy who probably familiarized us with it, who popularized it, was a well-known Christian author, a guy by the name of C.S. Lewis. And in his groundbreaking book known as Mere Christianity, this is what he said. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying, that the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing Lewis says we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. A lot of critics in recent years have said that this is a simplistic argument to make it something that amateur apologists turn to. And while I'm quite certain that their intellects will dwarf many of our intellects, I respectfully disagree with them. I think it really does come down to that. Do you believe the claims that he made? Do you believe the miracles that he performed? Do you believe what the Bible says about him, what God the Father said about him? Do you believe the prophecies that he fulfilled? Do you believe that he is the Lord of all creation? Because if he isn't, the Lord of all creation, then he can only be a liar, a lunatic, or the stuff of legend. Let me put it up for you in a picture so you can see it. Jesus did not claim to be God on the one side, then he's just mere legend. He never said that he was God, and we're going to look predominantly at that today. Or Jesus did claim to be God. If his claim was true, wonderful, then he's the Lord of the universe. If his claim was false, he knew it was false, he was lying. If he didn't know it was false, he was deluded or he was crazy. You know, that doesn't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus was who he said he was. It certainly doesn't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was God if we reason through that process. But what it does do for us in a very simple, straightforward fashion is confront us with the reality that those are the only choices that are open to us. And I trust that today, and if you want to look at some of the other messages that I've preached on this, please let me know. I'll forward them to you. But I trust today, as we look specifically at this area of legend, did Jesus actually claim to be God? We will come to the conclusion when we examine his claims that if they're not true, then he had to be one of those three other things: liar, lunatic, or legend. But if they are true, and I trust that you'll see that this is the most natural conclusion to come to, that he is indeed the Lord of the universe. See, the early years of Christ's life were very modest indeed. Many of you will know that he was born in a stable. It probably wasn't a stable. It probably was a cave on the outskirts of Jerusalem. It was a cave inhabited by animals. And also in the wall there were these crevices where often grave cloths were kept. It was a burial cave, but animals often inhabited that cave. And so when Jesus was born and the weather was cold, those grave clothes, those strips of grave cloth were taken out to wrap him in order to keep him warm. So he was born there, and then he moved to a very obscure village, the village of Nazareth. In fact, many of you will be familiar with a passage where Nathanael and Philip are talking, and they're reasoning amongst themselves and asking, can anything good ever come out of Nazareth? Can anything good ever come out of Nazareth? There Jesus grew up. He worked there in the carpentry shop of his earthly guardian, Joseph. Yet, friends, I want to tell you, despite those very humble beginnings of his, he was never under any illusion as to who he was. He understood his person and he understood his purpose in life. And he began to declare very early on in his life that there was more to him than met the eye, that he was, in fact, God in human flesh. Those who are confused about his claims can't possibly ever have read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels that we have in our New Testament. They could never have thumbed through those pages. And what I want to do this morning is I want to take you to two passages. They're both in the Gospel of John, John chapter 4 and John chapter 5. And we'll see that in John chapter 4, Jesus presents us with this unambiguous piece of evidence regarding his identity, his deity. And then in the second passage, John chapter 5, we'll see 5 claims that he makes to being God. And so it is befuddling that there are those that say that Jesus never claimed to be God, because he certainly did. You know, John 4, the passage we're going to be in first, starts off with the evidence that there was some tension between Jesus and the religious leaders of the Jews, a group of guys called the Pharisees. They were looking for a fight because his followers were growing so rapidly in number. And if you go back to John chapter 3, you'll see that where this fight started was that these Pharisees were trying to create some dissension between the disciples of Jesus and the disciples of John the Baptist. And Jesus wasn't having any of it. He didn't want this to deteriorate into some mud fight. And so what he did is he took his disciples out of that environment and he headed up north. Now, if you were living during that time, you'd understand that there were a number of ways that you could actually get up north from Jerusalem. There were a number of ways that you could travel. You could travel along the coast where it was bright and breezy and you could breathe in that fresh ocean air. You could cross over the Jordan and then head up through Perea, or you could just take the most direct route. The problem was that most Jews didn't like to take the direct route because it went through an area inhabited by a group of people known as the Samaritans. The Samaritans were really the product of an intermingling, an intermarriage of Jews and Assyrians, and so they were viewed by the Jews as being half-breeds. In fact, the Jews often referred to the Samaritans as dogs. And yet that's the path that Jesus chose to travel. And we read in John 4, verse 4, now he had to go through Samaria. I've already established for you that he certainly didn't have to go through Samaria, not from a geographical perspective, but spiritually, as we'll find out, Jesus had to go through this area inhabited by the Samaritans. He had to do that because he was having an appointment with a woman that he was eventually going to meet at a well. See, the prejudice of the people that he was surrounded by, the prejudice of the Jews, wasn't going to keep him from having that life-changing conversation with the Samaritan woman. And he immediately catches her off guard. How did he do that? Well, he was a Jew and he was a man. Jews weren't expected in the area. Jews certainly never spoke to Samaritans, and in general at that time, Jewish men definitely didn't speak to women who weren't Jews. And so he arrests her attention by talking to her. He catches her off guard, and the first thing that he begins to talk to her about is her perceived need. Why was she at the well? Why was she at Jacob's well? Well, she was thirsty. She was there during the day, probably at noon, and the reason that she was there at that time of the day, the hottest time of the day, was because she wanted to avoid bumping into a bunch of other people. We'll find out that she had good reason for doing that. This was not a woman of great moral fiber or character, so she wanted to avoid others. But she goes to this well, and Jesus speaks to her perceived need, and her perceived need is, I need water. I need sustenance. And Jesus says to her, well, the water that you are going to draw from this well, when you drink it, you're going to thirst again. But the water that I'm offering you, living water, is water that you can drink and cause you never to thirst again. And as she's trying to figure things out, she gets a little confused between the physical and between the spiritual, and she doesn't understand exactly what it is that Jesus is talking to her about. But whatever it was that he was offering, she wanted it because she didn't want to come back to that well. And so her confusion provides Jesus with a great opportunity, a wonderful opportunity to reveal a little bit of his divine nature, his omniscience, the fact that he knows everything. He'd never met this woman before. And yet he starts giving details, minute details about her past failures and in fact her present failures. And immediately she assumes he must be, this guy talking to me, he must be some kind of prophet. And they talk a little bit about Mount Gerizim, about Moriah, and what true worship is. And then the moment critique arrives in verse 25 of our passage where we read this. The woman said, I know that Messiah called Christ is coming. And when he comes, he will explain everything to us. Then Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. And just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked, what do you want? Or why are you talking with her? Then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? They came out of the town and made their way toward him. From the verses that we've just read, it would appear that at that particular point in time, people were awaiting the coming of the Messiah. Just ordinary, everyday people looking for the coming of the Messiah. They knew about the prophecies and they were waiting for his coming. And when the Samaritan woman revealed as much, revealed that she had met this individual who might fit that profile, Jesus doesn't stutter when he confirms what she's saying. He doesn't say to her, no, you're confused. I'm not the one you think I am. He didn't correct her in any way, shape, or form. He simply responded, I, the one who speak to you, I am he. See, friends, right from the start, Jesus wasn't in the least bit confused about who he was. And so before we even turn to John chapter 5 and look at the 5 claims that he made towards the fact that he was God, we can already dismiss one of those reasons, one of those designations that we looked at right at the beginning. There can be no disputing that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, that he claimed to be God, and so it was not the stuff of legend. Now that doesn't say that what he was saying, that the claims he was making were accepted by all the people, and certainly not that they were accepted by all of you. But the bottom line is, we can go to Scripture and point out very clearly to people that Jesus claimed to be God. John 5 really hammers home that point because it gives us 5 different things that Jesus says pointing towards his deity. Now, I don't know about you, but oftentimes when I go into difficult conversations, I'm sure a lot of you do the same thing. Oftentimes when I go into difficult conversations, I kind of try to soften the person up a little bit. You know, maybe tell them some good things about themselves. We have a quiet conversation. It's comfortable, and then I say, there is something I want to talk to you about. Jesus didn't actually do that. You know, you kind of tend to quiet the waters before you jump in. Jesus just stirred up things right from the beginning. So instead of just calming things down, he actually offends the people that he's talking to. He offends them. See, Jesus was in Jerusalem for the Passover feast at this particular point in time, and he wandered down the road and he came to a pool, a certain pool that some of you will be familiar with, called the Pool of Bethesda. And legend had it that at a time during the day, an angel would come and stir up the waters of the pool, and then the poor disabled people that were hanging around the pool would clamor to try to get into the pool and miraculously be healed. Well, Jesus wanders down to this pool and he sees an individual sitting there, and because he is all-knowing, he approaches this individual who's been in his current state for over 30 years, and he singles him out, a desperate individual, he singles him out to heal him. And we pick up the account in John 5, verse 5. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, do you want to get well? Kind of seems like a fairly obvious answer, right? Been this unwell for 38 years. And Jesus asked him, do you want to get well? Sir, the invalid replied, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. Then Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat and walk. And at once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and he walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" And so that's what he did. So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. And later Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. You've got to be astonished at the level of callousness of the Pharisees, don't you? I mean, 38 years. This guy's been an invalid, can't get into the pool. Jesus comes along, heals him, and what's their concern? He healed on the Sabbath. He healed on the Sabbath, and not only did Jesus heal on the Sabbath, the man himself who had been healed, who can now walk, is told by Jesus to take up his mat. And the Pharisees have a problem with that he's carrying his mat on the Sabbath. Friends, we need to understand that Moses in the law really gave one key rule regarding the Sabbath, one law that governed it. This is the Sabbath day, keep it holy. That's what Moses was concerned about. A day on which to rest, a day on which to focus on God. And yet these religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, had added in excess of 1,500 laws to govern the Sabbath alone. And Jesus and this poor man who could now walk had broken their rules. And so they became enraged. And we might think that if Jesus started off by offending them, maybe as he sees them rising up and becoming enraged by the offense that he'd caused by healing on the Sabbath, that maybe he'd try to calm the waters now, but he doesn't. He just stirs them up even further by making these 5 claims to deity. And the first one he does is he claims to be God in the flesh. John 5 verse 17, he says this, in his defense, Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working." Now as Gentiles, we read that and it doesn't kind of jump out at us, right? As to what he's saying. It doesn't jump out to us that is one of the claims he's making to deity. But we need to understand that while God didn't create on the Sabbath day, the creation account in Genesis tells us that, he certainly wasn't idle. He was busy. What was he busy doing? Well, Scripture tells us elsewhere that he was busy holding his creation together. He was literally sustaining his creation. And what Jesus says in this verse is that the work that I am doing is similar to the work that is being done by God the Father. But what would have really rattled the cages of these Jewish leaders was Jesus speaking about God as my Father. See, they had no problem referring to God as our Father, but Jesus made it personal. He said he's my Father. And he wasn't just saying he's my Father and making it personal that way. He was actually saying a lot more. We might have missed it as Gentiles, but the Jews of the day didn't. And we know that from verse 18. For this reason, they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. That's why they got upset. You know, calling him my Father and not meaning that might have just been considered an oversight. Maybe in his desire to help, he healed the man on the Sabbath. And so that might have just been considered neglect. But the Jews understood exactly what he was saying. He was saying, I am God in the flesh. And so we need to realize that to the Jews, this was brazen blasphemy. Here was a man claiming to be God, the God that they worship, but to Jesus, it's just a simple statement of fact. The next thing we see that he claims to be able to do is Jesus claimed power to raise the dead. Verse 21, for just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. Verse 25, very truly I tell you, a time is coming and has now come when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the fact that amongst the Jews, amongst the religious leaders of the Jews, you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and in a group of guys, about 70 guys who held a lot of political and financial clout in the nation, the Sadducees were the dominant ones. And they had something which kind of set them apart in terms of their belief. Everyone else believed that there would be a resurrection. Everyone else believed that at some point people would be raised from the dead, but not the Sadducees. And Pastor Dennis always used to say they didn't believe in the resurrection, and that's why they were sad, you see. Just to help you remember that. Martha confidently declared, even when her brother had been in the tomb for 4 days, she declared that I know that Lazarus will rise up again in the resurrection. She'd been taught that since she was a child, that there was a resurrection taking place. In her mind and in the mind of most of the Jews, it was a certainty. And they also associated this work of raising people from the dead, they associated with that as falling squarely and exclusively in the domain of God. Only he could do it. Only he could guarantee that it would take place. Of course, they were well aware of the fact that some of their heroes, prophets that had preceded them, Elijah and Elisha, had actually raised people from the dead. But they were under no illusions that they hadn't done that in their own power, but that they had in fact done that in the power of God. Now, if that's all that Jesus was saying, that I raised or I will raise people like Elijah and Elisha did, that might have raised some eyebrows, but that wasn't all that he was saying. Jesus was claiming that he was the one in whom the power to raise people from the life actually resided, just like it did in the Father. Our friends, anyone can say that. Anyone can say that I have the power to raise from the dead, but how do we prove what they're saying is true? Well, why don't you go ahead and raise someone from the dead? And so that's what Jesus did. Jesus raised the widow from Nain's son. He raised Jairus' daughter, and he had just raised Lazarus not long before this time, or would raise Lazarus not long after this time in John chapter 11. Jesus proved these claims that he was making. He not only said that the power to raise the dead is within me, the same power that is that of God the Father, he demonstrated that by actually raising people from the dead. Thoroughly familiar with the words of the prophet Daniel stated in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2, that the dead would be raised, some to everlasting life and others to everlasting condemnation. Jesus was once again indicating that he was God. And of course, he personally died and rose again as well, adding clout to his claim, answering that question, who is life in himself and the inherent power to raise the dead? God alone. You know, when someone is appointed a judge, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that, a lot of power that obviously comes with that as well. But a lot of responsibility that comes with that, even in an earthly court. But just imagine being the one given the responsibility to sit in judgment of all mankind. All mankind. Those that put their faith in you, trusting you for their salvation at a judgment called the Bema seat, as well as those that will one day stand before you to face their final condemnation at the great white throne judgment. And as Jesus continues in this passage in John 5, that's the role that he claims next in verse 22 and verse 27. Jesus claimed to be the future judge of all men. Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son. And he has given him authority to judge because he is the Son of Man. That certainly would have been news to the Jews. In fact, some of them might even have protested at this point in time and said, but doesn't the book of Genesis claim that God the Father is the judge of all people? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? How could Jesus rightly say that he was responsible for judging all of mankind when Moses seemed to state the opposite in Genesis chapter 18? Well, it would only be a contradiction if he wasn't God. But since he was, there was no contradiction at all. He was the omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, sovereign of the universe, and so he was also its judge. Do you have, if you're here this morning and you don't know Christ as your Savior, you've never put your faith and trust in him, do you have this inkling that sometimes kind of becomes more of a conviction that one day you are going to be held responsible for your life? For how you lived it, for what choices you made, for who or what you put your faith in. It would appear from history that most people do. They have this notion, irrespective of who they are or what they believe, atheist or agnostic, that one day they are going to stand before a supreme power of some kind. One day they're going to come face to face with him. And at the moment of death, their dogged determination to resist him, to reject him, to deny him, to not put their trust in him, it evaporates into thin air. Some, like the agnostic Professor J.H. Huxley and the English infidel Sir Francis Newport, even catch a glimpse of what it's going to be like to stand before him. The woman who nursed J.H. Huxley through his last illness said this: as he lay